Hello, I'm Dale Hall, CEO of Ducks Unlimited, but also a proud board member of America's Wetland Foundation. I want to start off by saying hello to two old friends of mine, Governor Pat Quinn and Mark Miller. Both of you have been friends over the years, and I want to thank you for everything you've done and everything you're doing to help us get this across. We're here to talk about some pretty important issues, some pretty important things, and a lot of promise that of what we can do together. I want to talk about the river. The river is why we're all here. Up and down from its headwaters to the Gulf Stream, the river has been a lifeblood over the years. When we first came to the river, we came asking, well, what can the river give? We came there because it gave us food, it gave us fish, gave us wildlife, gave us shelter, gave us the ability to move. Then commerce came. All those different kinds of things that we discovered the river could give us. And we took it for that. Over centuries, we took the river for what it could give. But then as time moved on, we started to think about, well, what do we want it to give? And we started looking at things like, well, now navigation and the development of communities and the movement of goods up and down the river. And so in 1898, Congress passed the first law really dealing with this. It was the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1898. The Corps of Engineers was to make sure that the Mississippi River stayed open for navigation. Well, actually all rivers, but the Mississippi was a primary focus. It was stayed open for navigation so that people could move their goods and services up and down the river. And as we moved along through history, things started to change. People developed along in the floodplains and along the banks of the Mississippi River. Communities came up, farming, different kinds of industries started to develop. And the commerce brought those, the navigation brought those things. But we also started to look at the issues of flood control. In 1929, the stock market crashed. Then we had the huge floods of 27 and 34 and 35 along the Mississippi River, and the mindset started to change. We started to think of the river as something that maybe we needed to try and control, we as a people. But there were other things involved here too. One of them was that people were out of work. You have to remember back in the Dust Bowl and back in the stock market crash, people needed to go to work. So they started to look at flood control as a means of putting people to work. And before this all started, there was the standing policy. When I started out on the Mississippi River working in the 70s, I ran across a pamphlet one time, and that pamphlet said, God creates floods, but man creates flood damage. Now that was put out by the Corps of Engineers. And so the policy of the federal government was, it's between you and God to work it out if you're going to live or farm or do something in the floodplain. But after the stock market, the need to put people to work, the Dust Bowl, the floods, all of these things coming together in the 20s and the 30s, we started to have real flood control efforts. And in the early 40s, I believe 1941, the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project Act was passed. Now the problem with that, the good part, the bad part, the good part was that it said we're going to try and control the flooding along the Mississippi River, and we're going to make sure navigation is there. Two primary purposes, flood control, navigation. The bad part was that it didn't think about all the other ramifications that were going to occur there. The Mississippi River had a floodplain that was 100 miles wide. A floodplain 100 miles wide. And we were going to constrict it down into this very narrow corridor using levees and dredging and keeping the navigation channels open and the flood contained within those levees as best we could. Well, that started to bring in other ramifications. People started to move into the floodplain saying, well, I have protection now. People downstream started to say, well, when do I get it? When's my turn? So it started moving almost in a domino effect downstream with flood control occurring, the loss of habitat, but the increase of navigation, the increase of economics, the increase of all those other sorts of things. When we look at development and the resources along the river, it's not one of good and bad. It is one of one type of benefit and one type of detriment, no matter what you do when man starts to try and manage. And that's what we did. It wasn't anybody's fault. There were no bad guys or good guys. We just did this together. And we started moving in to how can we control the river. So we had navigated, no pun intended, from it being one of what does the river give us to what do we want the river to give, and how can we manage that, control that, and make it happen. Well, as that happened and the protection came in, these rich, fertile lands on the outside of these levees and all along that 100-mile width there, agriculture started to come in, and agriculture is really important. But it also controlled where the rivers went. When I started out in the 70s and working in Louisiana on a wetlands issue, this is in Louisiana, and there was this little ridge, and ridges are relative in Louisiana. It wasn't very high. But it was called a point bar by geologists that we brought in, where the river deposited sediments. But what we found out, it wasn't the Mississippi River that deposited them. It was the Ohio River depositing sediments in Louisiana. So these rivers did this meandering all up and down, changed courses and did everything that they needed to up along the way. And these levees changed that. It made the river a defined corridor where all of the water would go. And on the outside, people had a hope that they would have the kind of protection that they needed to be able to live, farm, and move on. But agriculture has now evolved because of the loss of the native wetlands that came along with that. Now, rice in the lower Mississippi Valley is extremely important to waterfowl. Now, that's something pretty important to me because that's what we do for a living. But this year, we broke records of how many birds flew down the different flyways for the fall flight. Now, they've been keeping records since 1955. And this year we have more waterfowl on the nesting grounds, 48.6 million were counted, largest number on record. And then they, of course, had young, and the fall flight, we estimate conservatively at 130 to 160 million birds coming down the 4 flyways this year. Now, the North American Waterfowl Management Plan only calls for 100 million as being a real success story. So we are really blowing the doors off. The right question, though, is not how, so what's the big deal? The right question is, how is it we can have that kind of productivity, record-breaking numbers of birds, while we have lost 70% of our native grassland habitat for nesting along the way? How is it that those two can come together and make sense? Well, it comes from agriculture. In the nesting grounds, we have winter wheat that is serving us very well in replacing and being a surrogate for grasslands. But in the lower Mississippi Valley and along the Mississippi River, rice has become the surrogate wetland. It provides the nutrients. It provides the decomposing stems of the rice so that invertebrates can come feed off. The food chain can develop as it would have with detritus in the floodplain of the native and natural floodplain of the Mississippi. Rice stalks start that going with fungi and bacteria, and then invertebrates come in, and then of course that's huge food sources for all kinds of birds and amphibians that live in wetlands. So rice and agriculture are true partners with all of us in conservation, and it's not a trade-off. We need them both. We need all of these different things. Then, of course, what does it matter to the communities, to the people along the way about having healthy fish, wildlife populations? It matters because they bring money. The economy of fishing and hunting in the United States is over $100 billion a year is spent on those activities. That's just hunting and fishing. You start bringing in recreation and all these other sorts of things and tourism, and you're quickly approaching $1 trillion across this country on what kind of economics are driven by these aspects of our society. So all of these things are important. And then you get to the Gulf Coast and you look at how important energy is. The oil and gas industry has been a godsend to the Gulf Coast from an economic standpoint and a challenge. in understanding how to be able to extract it and not harm the natural resources any more than is necessary. But again, this is not a good thing or a bad thing. This is an important aspect of our economy that we need to work together to figure out how to make work and how to bring profit and sustainable fish and wildlife. Oil and gas industry has been very good about working with us on that. We believe we've been very good about working with them as well, but this has to continue. Then the navigation, all these different sorts of things have happened. But one of the unintended consequences of this history that I've been giving you is that each step along the way, and it sort of culminated in the late 60s and early 70s with the passage of the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the Endangered Species Act, and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, later known as the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. All those laws were passed in a bundle really close to each other in the late 60s and 70s. And as they were passed, they put new burdens on how to manage a project. But as we've gone through the decades, policies were developed that, all right, we'll take care of the community on this policy, we'll take care of flood control on this policy, we'll take care of navigation on this policy, we'll take care of the fish and wildlife resources on this policy, but unintended, not intentionally, but they didn't look to see how they meshed together. They didn't look to see, well, is this going to impact this one? And so now we have truly conflicting policies, and that is a huge issue that we're going to have to work through. But I believe the states up and down the river can be huge allies in helping us clean this up and make sure that all the policies make sense, as well as trying to make sure that these natural resources and the economic drivers sustain ourselves. The last thing I'll touch on is how important that wetlands are to structures and people in flood control. Down on the Gulf Coast, you'll hear back and forth through every hurricane. Well, this place over here is exposed, and this place over here is protected. Well, they're not really talking about levees. They're talking about wetlands, because now the Weather Channel people have started to understand that for every 2.7 miles that a hurricane travels over emergent marsh, the storm surge is reduced by approximately a foot. Now, there used to be hundreds of miles below New Orleans and below the Louisiana coastline as we know it today of wetlands that are now gone or open water. We lose a football-size area of wetlands every 30 minutes while we're talking and while we're meeting here. And that's been going on since I was a graduate student in the mid-70s in Louisiana at LSU. So this is not something new, it's been going on. It has been arrested somewhat, but it's still 24 square miles per year that are being lost. So these issues are really important. Having those wetlands there help protect storm surges, help diminish them and protect communities. And I used to always say that it is the wetlands that protect the levees and the levees that protect the people, because it was a levee that blew in Pontchartrain that caused New Orleans to have the disaster that it had. And had the wetlands storm slowed down the way Camille did just 35 or 40 years ago, same path, same strength, went to Biloxi, all those houses stayed, New Orleans stayed, everything survived that storm. Same path for Katrina and had disaster. Nothing but slabs left in Gulfport and Biloxi, and the Pontchartrain levee ruptured, and all the disaster occurred. I'm not a geologist, but I would argue that having those wetlands go away over 1,000 square miles in that time helped cause that damage to occur. So there are a myriad of benefits here that is not anyone's real fault. It's just the way things have happened. We have not worked together. And what this forum is about is to ensure that we don't allow anyone to say you must choose. We're not all going to get everything we want. But if we're sitting around the table talking to each other, we can get all of the values that are important to us. The river has changed from what can it give us, and we found that it gave us an ecosystem, to now it is a value system of all these different things that housed inherently in it is an ecosystem as well. But this is our value system. Let us not allow anyone to diminish or break up our value system. I wish I could be there with you, but I'm sorry I can't, but I know you're going to have a great meeting, and I wish you well, and let's get this to the point where everyone up and down the river says, that's my river. I own it. I'm going to take care of it. Thank you very much.